My name is Ruth Calloway. I was 68 years old when my daughter looked across a Thanksgiving table covered in the dishes I had spent 2 days cooking and told the people I loved most in this world that I was a burden. She did not whisper it. She did not pull me aside. She said it the way you say something you have been holding in your mouth for a long time and finally decided to spit out. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I sat very still with my hands folded in my lap, the way my own mother taught me to sit when something hurt so badly you did not trust yourself to move. What my daughter did not know, what none of them knew, was that my granddaughter Cassie had been sitting quietly at the far end of that table the whole time, and Cassie had already found the safe. I am telling you this story now, 3 years later, because I finally feel ready, because I think there are women watching this who have had something taken from them by people they fed and clothed and drove to school on cold mornings. And I think they deserve to know that the truth has a way of coming back, like a letter that was lost in the mail for years, and then one day just shows up at your door. Welcome back to Drama Stories. This is where ordinary people tell the truth about extraordinary pain, without shouting, without begging, without performing for an audience that doesn't believe them anyway. If you have ever been called difficult or dramatic or ungrateful by someone you sacrificed for, then sit with me for a while. This story is for you, and before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. I always love seeing those little towns and cities appear. It makes this feel less lonely, for all of us. I grew up in Millhaven, Tennessee, a small town about 40 minutes south of Nashville. Not the Nashville of music videos and bachelorette parties. The Nashville of gravel driveways and church potlucks and neighbors who still brought casseroles when someone passed. My family had lived in Millhaven for 4 generations. My great-grandmother was buried in the Baptist Church Cemetery on Locust Hill Road, and I used to walk up to that cemetery on Sunday afternoons when I was a girl, just to sit in the quiet. I married Harold Calloway when I was 23. Harold was a quiet man with large hands and a laugh that surprised you every time you heard it, because it was so much bigger than the rest of him. We bought our house on Sycamore Creek Road in 1981. 3 bedrooms, a front porch, a garden in the back that Harold spent every weekend in from April through October. We paid that house off in 2003. I remember the day we burned the mortgage papers in the kitchen sink, the two of us laughing like children. We had 2 daughters. Diane was the older one, and Patty was the younger. I loved them both with the kind of love that does not calculate. I packed their lunches. I sat in cold bleachers watching their soccer games. I drove Diane to auditions for the school play 3 towns over and waited in the car for 2 hours reading a paperback. I held Patty's hand through a miscarriage she never told her husband about until I encouraged her to, years later. That is the kind of mother I was. Not perfect, but present. Harold passed in 2016 from a heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March. He was 69 years old. He was supposed to plant tomatoes that weekend. I found the seed packets still sitting on the kitchen counter when I came home from the hospital without him, and I could not bring myself to move them for 6 months. After Harold died, things changed in ways I could not have anticipated. Patty lived in Colorado by then, and she called regularly, even flew out for holidays when she could. But Diane lived 20 minutes away in the same county, and somehow that closeness made things worse instead of better. Diane had always been the one who liked to manage things. When she was 12, she reorganized the family pantry without being asked, labeled everything in her best handwriting. I thought it was cute then. Somewhere along the way it stopped being cute. Her husband, Glenn, was a contractor. They had done well for themselves. A nice house over in Fairview with a 3-car garage and a finished basement. Glenn was not a bad man, but he was a man who was always looking at what something was worth. He would walk into a room and his eyes would go to the ceiling, the floors, the fixtures, calculating. Their children were my grandchildren, and I loved them purely. The oldest was Marcus, 22 when this story happened. Then Cassie, who was 19. Cassie was the quiet one, the reader, the one who remembered things you said in passing, months later. People sometimes underestimated Cassie because she did not talk much. That was their mistake. The first warning came about 18 months after Harold died, at a Sunday dinner I had made in my own kitchen. Diane and Glenn and the kids were there. We were eating pot roast, and somewhere between the second helping and the pie, Glenn mentioned that the houses in our area were going for a lot these days. That little Miller place on Elm sold for $380, he said, cutting his meat. 3 bedrooms, smaller lot than yours. I said that was something. I did not think much of it. A few weeks later, Diane called to ask whether Harold had left a will. I told her yes, we had updated our wills together in 2014. She asked where it was. I told her it was with our attorney, Bernard Holt, who had been our family lawyer since the mid-90s. She said she was just asking because she wanted to make sure everything was in order. I told myself she was being responsible. The second warning came that Christmas, when I overheard Marcus saying something to Glenn in the hallway outside the bathroom. I was coming down the stairs, quietly in my socked feet. Marcus said, "She's not going to want to move." And Glenn said, "She will when the time is right. These things take patience." I rounded the corner before they saw me, and they changed the subject so fast it almost gave me whiplash. I told myself I had misheard. I told myself it was about something else entirely, but I started noticing things after that. How Diane would sometimes look around my house when she visited, the way Glenn looked at rooms, like she was mentally measuring something. How she started calling it the property instead of your house or home when we talked about it. How she began mentioning, oh so gently, stories about older women who had trouble keeping up with maintenance. Janet Birch's mother fell on her back steps, she told me one February. Living alone at that age in a big house, it just isn't safe, Mom. I was 67 years old. I drove myself everywhere. I cooked 3 meals a day. I gardened in Harold's honor every spring. I was not some trembling shadow of myself. But Diane kept painting that picture. Slowly, patiently. Then one afternoon in September, 2 months before that Thanksgiving, my neighbor Dorothy came over for coffee and mentioned that a man had stopped by asking whether I had ever talked about selling my house. She described him to me, and it sounded like Glenn. I did not say a word to Dorothy about what I thought. But when she left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. That was when I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. If you are a mother or a grandmother watching this, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had the feeling that someone who loves you is also quietly drawing a map around what you own? Not because they are evil, but because they have decided, somewhere in the back of their mind, that your things are already theirs. They are just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. If that sounds familiar, stay with me. Because what comes next will matter to you. I want to tell you about the old safe. When Harold and I bought the house on Sycamore Creek Road, there was already a small fireproof safe bolted to the floor of the bedroom closet. It had been there since the previous owners, a couple named the Pruitts. Harold used it for the house deed, the car titles, some bonds his father had left him, and a life insurance policy. He was the only one who knew the combination. He had written it in a small notebook he kept tucked inside his reading Bible on the nightstand. After Harold died, I had opened the safe once to retrieve the life insurance papers. I remembered the combination from the notebook, but after I was done, I had not opened it again. There seemed to be no reason to. The deed was in there. Some old bonds that had matured and been cashed years before. A few personal things, letters Harold had kept from his mother, a photograph from our wedding rehearsal. I did not disturb them, but here is what I did not know. Harold had put something else in that Sammy's months before he died. Something I did not discover until Cassie found it. I will get to that. But first, I need to tell you about Thanksgiving. Dion offered to host Thanksgiving that year, which was unusual. Normally I hosted. I had hosted every single Thanksgiving for 22 years, except for the one right after Harold died, when I could not face a full table. I had not asked for the tradition to change, but Diane said she wanted to give me a break. I should have understood what that meant. I arrived with my sweet potato casserole and my cranberry bread, because I could not come to someone's table empty-handed. It was not in me. Patty had flown in from Colorado with her husband, Ray. Marcus was there. Cassie was there, quiet in the corner with a book until dinner was called. Glenn's brother Tim and his wife Sharon were also there, which I found odd. This was a family holiday, not a gathering for Glenn's side. Dinner was fine until it was not. We were well into the meal when Diane set down her fork and said, "I want to talk about something while we are all together." Glenn folded his hands on the table. Tim and Sharon exchanged a look. Pete said, "What is it?" Diane looked at me, and I will tell you what I saw in her face. Not cruelty. Something almost worse than cruelty. Certainty. She had decided something a long time ago and had been waiting for this moment the way you wait for a train you already know is coming. "We've been talking," she said, meaning herself and Glenn, "about Mom's situation. About the house." I said, "My situation." She did not acknowledge the edge in my voice. "Mom, that house is too much for one person. The yard alone is almost an acre. The maintenance is going to become more than you can handle. And the property at this point is worth more than—" Diane. That was Patty. "Can we maybe talk about this after? Patty, this is a practical conversation that this family has been avoiding." Diane's voice was controlled. Very controlled. The voice of someone who had rehearsed. "Mom, we are worried about you. We think it would make more sense for you to be somewhere with more support. Somewhere smaller. Glenn and I have looked at a couple of very nice senior communities about 20 minutes from here." I said, "You have been looking at senior communities for me. We have been looking into options, yes. Without asking me, because we knew you would react thus, eh?" The table went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for something to resolve. The held breath quiet of people watching something happen that they are not sure they should stop. I said, "What way is that, Diane?" And that was when she said it, not looking at me. Looking at the centerpiece, or the window, or some point in the middle distance where she did not have to see my face. She said, "You have become a burden, Mom. I don't mean that unkindly, but someone has to say it. This house, your finances, all of it. It has become something that the rest of us are responsible for managing, and it is not fair to us." I heard Patty make a sound. I heard Glenn clear his roast. I heard Tim refill his water glass. And I heard Cassie, from the end of the table, very quietly set down her fork. I did not speak for a long moment. I breathed. I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised, who had cried in my arms over things that seemed so small now, who had worn the dress I helped her pick for her prom, who had called me from the hospital at 2 in the morning the night Marcus was born and said, "Mama, I'm scared," and I had driven to her in the dark without a second thought. I said, "I see." Diane said, "It isn't personal, Mom. It's just reality." I said, "I think I would like to go home now." I drove home alone in the dark. The sweet potato casserole was still on Diane's table. I had not been offered to take it back. I drove the 15 miles to Sycamore Creek Road without the radio, without anything, just the sound of the tires and the shape of the dark fields passing. I turned into my gravel driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes before I could go inside. My house was dark and quiet. It smelled the way it always smelled. Wood and old cotton and something faintly, like the Cedar Herald, had put in all the closets. I turned on the lamp in the living room and stood in the middle of the floor and looked at this house. The photographs on the walls, Harold's old chair, the quilt my grandmother had made, folded over the back of the sofa, the braided rug we had bought at a craft fair in 1988 and never once considered replacing because it still looked fine and we liked it. A burden. I had raised 2 daughters in this house. I had nursed a husband through 2 surgeries in this house. I had buried a dog in the backyard and cried for a week. I had learned to make bread in this kitchen and canned tomatoes every August, and sat at that table doing my taxes every spring with a pencil and a cup of tea, a burden. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. I did not cry. I was past crying. I was in that country that exists beyond tears, where everything is very flat and very clear. I picked up Harold's reading Bible from the nightstand. I had kept it there because I liked having it close. I opened it to where the bookmark was, which was Psalms, and I read a few verses without really taking them in, and then, because my hands needed something to do, I opened the cover and looked at the pages where Harold had written things. His handwriting, his notes in the margins. And there was the small folded piece of paper tucked into the inside back cover, where he had always kept the safe combination. I unfolded it. There was the combination, 5 digits that I already had memorized. But underneath the combination, in Harold's handwriting, there was a single sentence I had never seen before. It said, "Ruth, check the second envelope. I've put it there in January. You'll understand when you see it. I stared at that sentence for a long time, January. That would have been January 2016, 2 months before he died. I want you to stay with me here, because what came next changed everything. But I need to tell you about the phone call first. The one I got the morning after Thanksgiving, from Cassie. She called at 8 in the morning, which was early for her on a holiday weekend. I had not slept well. I was on my second cup of coffee, still in my robe. When I saw her name on the phone, I felt something loosen in my chest just slightly. "Grandma," she said, "I'm sorry about last night." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. "I know," she said, "but I want you to know I didn't agree with any of it." A pause. I was sitting there thinking, Grandma has been taking care of all of us our entire lives. She is not a burden. That word made me so angry I almost said something. I asked her why she didn't. "Because," she said slowly, "I didn't think that was the moment. I think the moment comes later." Something in the way she said it made me straighten up a little. "Cassie," I said, "what do you know?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grandma, I was in your house last spring, when you went to the pharmacy and left me there. Remember? You gave me the key to let in the plumber. And I was sitting in your bedroom, and I noticed the closet door was open, and I saw the safe, and I was curious. I'm sorry. I tried the combination from Papa Harold's Bible because I remembered watching him open it once when I was little. And it opened, and there were papers inside that I think you need to look at. But I didn't take anything out or move anything. I just saw what was there." I set down my coffee cup. "Come over," I said. Cassie was there in 40 minutes. She came in quietly, hugged me at the door, and sat at the kitchen table while I went to the bedroom. I opened the closet. I crouched down, knees aching, and turned the dial right, left, right, and heard the small, satisfying click of the safe coming open. Inside, there was the folder with the house deed, the old bonds, Harold's mother's letters, our wedding photograph. And in the back, tucked behind everything else, 2 envelopes held together with a single rubber band. The first envelope had my name on it in Harold's handwriting. The second was sealed and had the name of our attorney, Bernard Holt, written on it with the instruction, "To be opened in the event of a dispute over the estate of Harold Douglas Calloway." I brought both envelopes to the kitchen table. I sat down across from Cassie. My hands were not quite steady. I opened the first one. It was a letter from Harold, 4 pages, written in his careful hand. I will not read every word of it to you here. Those words belong to me. But I will tell you what it said in the parts that mattered most. Harold had been diagnosed with a cardiac arrhythmia in December of 2015. He did not tell me, because he did not want me to worry before the doctors knew more. He had begun putting his affairs more carefully in order. And in doing that, he had a long conversation with Bernard Holt. In that conversation, Harold told Bernard that he had some concerns about what might happen to the house after he was gone, specifically about Diane. He loved his daughter, he wrote. He truly did. But he had watched her relationship with Glenn shift him in ways that bothered Harold deeply. Glenn had mentioned the property value one too many times. And Harold was a man who had lived long enough to know what it meant when somebody started calculating the value of something that wasn't theirs yet. So Harold had done 3 things. First, he had updated his will to ensure that the house on Sycamore Creek Road was left entirely to me, with a provision that stated the property could not be transferred, sold, or signed over under any arrangement in which I was not the sole and fully competent decision-maker, witnessed by a non-family attorney. Second, he had put the house into a living trust, something I had not known about, with Bernard Holt as the trustee and myself as the lifetime beneficiary. The house could not be sold or transferred without the trustee's involvement, period. Third, and this was the second envelope, he had left a letter with Bernard, sealed, describing his concerns and his wishes in detail. That letter was to remain sealed unless someone tried to contest the estate or pressure me into decisions about the property. Harold had written, "Ruth, if you are reading this, it probably means something has happened that I was afraid might happen. I hope I am wrong. But I wanted you to have backup. I wanted you to not be alone in the room when it mattered. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I set the letter down on the table. Cassie had not said a word. She was watching me with her quiet eyes, hands folded in her lap. He knew, I said. She nodded. He set it up before he died. He must have loved you very much, Cassie said simply. And he must have known something the rest of us didn't. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, I need to call Bernard Holt. Don't go anywhere yet. Because the next part, the part where everything that had been done in private was brought into the light, that part is coming. And the person who did not expect to be in that room was the person who called me a burden. I called Bernard Holt on the Monday after Thanksgiving. Bernard was 71 years old and had been practicing family law in Millhaven for 40 years. He had a voice like gravel and a habit of pausing a very long time before he spoke, which used to bother me and now I found deeply reassuring. I told him I had found Harold's letter. I told him I was holding the second envelope. He was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then he said, Ruth, I am glad you called. I have been wondering when you would. I asked him whether he knew about the trust. He said, I drew it up. Harold came to me in January of 2016. He was specific about what he wanted. I asked whether Diane knew. No, Bernard said. Harold's instructions were that the trust information was not to be disclosed to any family member other than you. But Ruth, there is something you should know. I received a call 3 weeks ago from Glenn Whitmore, your son-in-law. I felt the cold run through me. He called to ask about the deed to Sycamore Creek Road. He said he was helping you with some estate planning. I told him that I was not in a position to discuss your estate with anyone other than you. He said you had authorized him to inquire. I told him that was not possible without a signed release from you. He did not call back. I asked Bernard what he thought Glenn was planning. Bernard said, I think they were checking to see if there were obstacles. I don't know what specific action they intended. But I think you should come in and we should review your full situation. And Ruth, I think you may want to decide how and when this information becomes known to your family. I said, I'll be there Thursday. I met with Bernard for 3 hours that Thursday. By the time I left his office, I had a clearer picture of my own life than I had had in years. The house was fully protected. The living trust Harold had put in place was airtight. Any attempt to pressure me into signing over power of attorney or selling the property would be flagged immediately. And Bernard was the first call that any title company or real estate agent would have to make. Harold had built a wall around our home, brick by quiet brick, and had not told me because he wanted me to find it only if I needed it. I wept in my car in Bernard's parking lot for 10 minutes. Then I dried my eyes and drove to the grocery store and bought the ingredients for a pot of soup. I did not contact Diane. I did not warn anyone. I waited. Deanne called me on the Saturday after my meeting with Bernard. She sounded careful on the phone, like someone walking on ice. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation at Thanksgiving. I know it was hard to hear. I said, Glenn and I have actually been in conversation with someone at a real estate office. Just to understand what your options are. There is no pressure. We just want to know that you are taken care of. I said, which real estate office? She named it. Morrison Property Group over in Franklin. I said, I see. And who have you been talking to there? She said a name. I wrote it down. Mom, she said, we really do care about you. This is coming from love. I said, I know, Diane. And I meant it, in some complicated and wounded way that I have never fully been able to untangle. She did love me, I believed that. She just loved the property more than she had realized. And Glenn had helped her believe that taking it was the same as taking care of me. I said, let's get the family together. I think it would be good to have a conversation with everyone present, including Bernard Holt. She paused. Why would Bernard need to be there? I said. Because there are some things about your father's estate that I think the family should understand. Things I should have shared sooner. I paused. How is next Saturday for lunch? At my house, she agreed. She sounded almost pleased, which told me she thought this was going to go the way she had planned. I called Patty that evening and told her everything. Patty cried on the phone, which was not what I needed, but I understood it. She was angry in a way I had not heard her angry since she was a teenager. She said, I will be there Saturday. You could not keep me away. I told her not to say anything to Diane beforehand. She said, I know how to keep my mouth shut, Mama. I called Cassie and told her the same. Cassie listened and then said, "Do you want me to record the meeting on my phone?" I had not thought of that. I told her that would not be necessary, but that I would love for her to be there. She said she would be in the front row. I called Bernard and asked him to come. He said he would bring the trust documents and Harold's sealed letter, which had never been opened. I asked him whether we should open it. He said, "I think, Ruth, that we should open it together, with everyone present." I spent that week cleaning my house, which I know sounds like a strange way to prepare for a reckoning. But I needed to do something with my hands. I cleaned the windows and waxed the floors and polished the wood on Harold's old chair. I bought fresh flowers for the kitchen table. I made a coffee cake the morning of the lunch. If I was going to have a hard conversation in my home, then my home was going to be at its best. That was how I was raised. They arrived at noon. Diane and Glenn, looking comfortable and arranged, like they had discussed on the drive over how this was going to go. Patty and Ray, Patty greeting me at the door with a hug that lasted longer than usual. Marcus, who looked puzzled to see Bernard Holt's car in the driveway. Cassie, quiet and steady, who squeezed my hand at the door and then went to sit in the chair by the window. Bernard arrived right at noon, carrying his brown leather satchel, wearing the same kind of suit he had worn to Harold's funeral. Glenn looked at Bernard across the kitchen, and I watched his expression shift. Not dramatically, just a small rearrangement, like furniture being moved in a dark room. Deanne said brightly, "Mr. Holt, thank you for coming." "I wasn't expecting," Ruth asked me. Bernard said simply. He set his satchel on the kitchen table, next to the coffee cake. We sat down, all of us, around the same kitchen table where I had eaten 10,000 meals with Harold, where my daughters had done their homework and my grandchildren had colored pictures and made a mess at Easter. The table felt significant in a way I could not have explained. I said, "I want to start by saying that I love everyone in this room. I want that to be understood before anything else is said." Diane nodded, as if this were a preamble to something she expected. "I have been thinking," I said, "about what was said at Thanksgiving, about being a burden." I let that word sit there for a moment. Nobody spoke. "I want you all to understand something. I have not been unclear about my wishes regarding this house. I have never said I wanted to sell it. I have never said I wanted to move, and I was never asked." Glenn cleared his throat. "Ruth, we have only been trying to help you think ahead." "Glenn," I said, "you called Bernard's office 3 weeks ago and told him I had authorized you to ask about the deed. I had not." The air in the room changed. Glenn's jaw moved, but he did not speak. Patty said quietly, "Glenn." Diane looked at her husband, and in that look, just a flicker, just a half second, I saw something I had not expected. I saw that she had not known about the call to Bernard. She had known about the real estate office, but not the call. Glenn had gone further than she knew. I said, "Bernard, would you explain the trust?" Bernard opened his satchel. He removed a set of documents held together with a black clip. He set them on the table and looked around the room with the calm, unhurried expression of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms like this one. "Harold Calloway established a living trust on January 14th, 2016, Bernard said. "I drew it up at his request. The terms are straightforward. The property at Sycamore Creek Road is held in trust for the lifetime benefit of Ruth Ellen Calloway. No sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the property can occur without the written consent of both the trustee, which is me, and Ruth. A single person cannot make that decision." Harold was very specific about that. Glenn said, "We were not informed of any trust." "No," Bernard said, "you were not. Harold's instructions were that the trust remain private unless needed." "Why would he?" "Because," Bernard said, with the particular quietness of a man who does not need to raise his voice, "he was worried about exactly this situation." Glenn stood up partway and then sat back down, which was something I had never seen him do before. Diane was very still. Her face had gone the color of old paper. She was looking at the documents on the table, not at me. "There is one more thing," I said. "Bernard, would you open the letter?" Bernard reached into the satchel and removed a sealed envelope. He opened it slowly. He put on his reading glasses. And then, in that quiet kitchen on a cold December Saturday, he read Harold's letter aloud. It was not a cruel letter. Harold was not a man who wrote with cruelty. But it was clear. He had written that he loved his daughters and that he was not writing this to punish anyone. He was writing it because he had seen the way Glenn talked about the house. He had seen the measuring in the man's eyes. He had seen Diane beginning to use the language of ownership about something that was not hers. He had seen the slow shift in the way they talked to me, the way they talked about me, the quiet reclassification of his wife from a person into a problem to be solved. He wrote, I am asking, in this letter, that my daughters remember what their mother did for them and for this family. Not as a calculation, not as a debt, but as a fact. She gave everything she had and asked for very little. Please give her this. Please leave her home. The kitchen was completely silent when Bernard finished reading. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear a car pass on the road outside. Cassie, from the chair by the window, had tears running silently down her face. Diane made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Like something releasing, and Glenn stood up and said, I need some air, and walked out the back door. We heard his footsteps on the porch steps. We did not hear him come back in for 20 minutes. If you are watching this from your own kitchen, in your own chair, in a house you have filled up with 50 years of life, I want you to know something right now. Your house is not just a property. It is the record of your life. It is where your people became your people. Don't let anyone turn it into a leads on a spreadsheet. The aftermath of that Saturday was not tidy. Real life is not tidy. Glenn came back inside and did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. He and Diane left before the coffee cake was finished. Diane said nothing to me on the way out except, I'll call you, Mom. Her voice was flat and exhausted, like the air going out of something. She did call, about 2 weeks later. It was the hardest phone call of my life, in some ways, because it was the first time I had heard my daughter cry the way a child cries. Not from frustration or anger, but from shame. She said she was sorry. She said Glenn had pushed her further than she had realized. She said she had never wanted to hurt me. She said she did not know about the call to Bernard. I believed her. I believe her still, but I also told her the truth, that the word she used at Thanksgiving, burden, was something that had gone into me like a splinter, and was not going to come out clean, that I was willing to work toward something better, between us, but that things could not go back to what they had been before, because what they had been before had allowed this to happen. She said she understood. I am not sure she did, fully, but she was trying. Glenn apologized in a text message 3 weeks later, which was very Glenn of him. 11 words. I did not respond for 3 days, and then I wrote back 2 words, thank you, that was what I had. Patty came and stayed with me for a week after Christmas that year. We cooked together and watched old movies and went to see Harold's grave on a clear, cold morning and stood there for a while without saying much. That week healed something in me. I do not know if I can explain exactly what. Cassie comes to see me at least twice a month. We have coffee, and she tells me about school, and I tell her about whatever I have been reading or growing or worrying about. And she listens the way Harold used to listen, fully, without looking at her phone. She is going to be something remarkable, that girl. She already is. Bernard retired the following spring. Before he did, he transferred the trust to a new attorney he trusted, a woman named Patricia Forda, who has an office over in Brentwood. Patricia came and had lunch with me so we could get acquainted. She reminded me a little of myself, 40 years ago, when I still thought the world would cooperate if you were reasonable enough. The house on Sycamore Creek Road is still mine. The garden came back beautifully this past spring, the best it has been since Harold died, honestly. I planted his tomatoes. I stood in the yard with dirt on my hands and the sun on my face and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not triumph, exactly. More like rightness, like being where you are supposed to be. I have thought a lot, in the years since, about what Harold did, about the quiet, careful love of it. He did not warn me. He did not write Diane a scolding letter or confront Glenn or create a scene. He simply built a wall around the thing he wanted protected, and he left me the key, and he trusted that I would find it when I needed to. I think about the women who don't have that, who don't have a Bernard Holt, or a living trust, or a granddaughter with steady eyes and a long memory. And I want to say something to those women directly. You are allowed to know what you own. You are allowed to talk to your own attorney without asking permission. You are allowed to make copies of your own documents and keep them somewhere safe and tell someone you trust exactly where they are. You are allowed to ask questions when something feels wrong, even when the people around you are telling you that you are being dramatic or difficult or making things harder than they need to be. You are not a burden. You are the person who made the house a home. If you have been watching this story and you thought of someone, your mother, your sister, your grandmother, your neighbor, the woman at your church who gave everything she had for 50 years, and is now sitting alone being slowly edged out of her own life, please send this to her, not because I need the views, but because she needs to know that someone else has been through something like this and come out standing. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. I always read everyone. If you are in Tennessee, I especially love to see it. If you are in Florida, or Ohio, or Georgia, or Texas, or somewhere cold and flat and beautiful in the Midwest, tell me. It makes me feel less like I am talking to myself in an empty room. And if this story reminded you of your own safe, your own deed, your own documents that you have not looked at in a while, go look at them this week. Pull them out and read them and know what they say. Harold would tell you the same thing. Take care of your heart, protect your peace, and take care of your home. I will see you in the next story. Bye bye.